Welcome to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corp Institute of Public Policy and Economy. I'm your host, Mitch Davidson. Today we're joined by Toronto City Councillor Jennifer McKelvie. Councillor McKelvie represents Ward 25, Scarborough-Rouge Park, and was elected for her first term in 2018. She's been very busy down at City Hall. She's the Vice Chair to the Infrastructure and Environment Committee, the Scarborough Community Council, and Chair of the Francophone Affairs Advisory Committee as well, among a number of other roles. Before politics, Councillor McKelvie had a distinguished career in science and academia. She's a professional geoscientist by trade with a PhD from the University of Toronto. Councillor McKelvie, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on my first podcast.
No, we really appreciate you coming on, especially with everybody's busy schedule right now, and happy to have you on your first podcast. I'll let you know that my first podcast was about 11 episodes ago, so you're in good hands, I think, with someone who understands what it's like. But I wanted to start it off on the questions and kind of getting into the conversation with you today about talking about the City of Toronto. Obviously, with COVID-19 and the pandemic that's faced us, a lot has changed, and we've got a really interesting financial situation. The TTC, the Transit Commission alone, is facing a $92 million monthly shortfall. The Mayor and Premier Doug Ford have both commented publicly that the municipal support allocations thus far, namely the $14 billion that was announced by the federal government, isn't enough, especially for the City of Toronto. The Mayor's been very clear to state that the province and the feds should do more for funding for the city. Otherwise, the city's going to have to make some cuts. So as a city councillor who's right in there on the floor dealing with this day in and day out, what's your view on the financial situation right now, and how do you think we get out of this?
Well, the situation is certainly very bleak, and there's no easy solution. Our weekly burn right now is $65 million a week, and that's $45 million in lost revenue from agencies like the TTC and the Toronto Zoo. Plus, we're losing an additional $20 million due to new expenses due to COVID, such as emergency childcare, shelters, sanitation, all those new costs that we only incur during a pandemic. So in total, if you look at it for a year, we're looking at a shortfall of about $1.5 billion if we don't get help from other levels of government. And we need that help because we don't want to cut important services. So we all know our city services affect our daily lives, whether it's transit, emergency services, water. They're all necessary, and the things that aren't necessary right now aren't operating. So our budget is very tight at the City of Toronto, and I don't think we can find savings and efficiencies and cuts to make up for this $1.5 billion. We need help from other levels of government.
Yeah, and I think, there's the old idiom that a lot of people say, which is this kind of idea that, the city government is the most local and the most important and the one that people interact with the most often. I think people very much are expecting and demanding for a good reason, their water to work and their garbage to be picked up. So I think, you make a good point in the sense that there's not a ton of efficiency there to be had for these sort of essential services. So with the pandemic, it's changed a lot of the thoughts that we had going in about city operations, the way that things are run. And a lot of important policy decisions are kind of on the table for the first time. So I wanted to kind of go through a few of them with you. And given there's a tendency to reevaluate everything that COVID-19 has impacted. So, I'll throw out a few and maybe just give your thoughts on them. But the first being sort of the city doesn't have the ability to run deficits even in extraordinary times. I'm wondering if your view on that has changed as a result of all this. Perhaps the city should put itself in a better fiscal situation to prepare for emergencies in advance. And then maybe we can get into a bit of the role of property taxes in all of this. So let's start with the deficits and the city's preparation for emergency situations.
Well, I don't think we want to change the law to allow us to have a deficit. I think annually it is important that our operating budget is balanced. And this year put an extraordinary drain on our resources, and we need extraordinary support from other levels of government to help. The federal announcement of $14 billion for municipalities isn't going to help because that's just an advance on money. It's not new money, it's money that we already had and we're accounting for. So you're right, we need to take this as an opportunity to prepare for fiscal emergencies and think about our future. And I've been giving a lot of thought lately on how we pay our taxes and our thoughts around that. And our income taxes come directly off our paychecks. Our sales tax is paid at point of sale, and we don't tend to give it as much thought as we do when we're writing a check to the city for property tax. That seems to be, it feels very different when the money comes directly out of your hand. And so I think we need to look at new sources of revenue, and it would be nice if the provincial government made more tools available to us. We need to look at road tolls. We need to look at municipal income taxes, municipal bonds, taxes on alcohol. There's a whole suite of options, some of them available to us right now under the law the way it exists, and some of them that it would be very nice if they were made available to us. And certainly, just like you say, as we plan for recovery, we need to think about how we pay for things, and that has to be an important part of the conversation.
Yeah, well, we've seen an interesting sort of push in recent months, and I think even frankly going to before the pandemic, of kind of this who does what conversation. And I know we famously had a who does what conversation back in the 90s, of which maybe some would argue it wasn't a conversation, but regardless, there was a who does what provincial jurisdictional review between the roles of cities and the province. And I wonder if you think that as part of this conversation on the way that things are funded, the services that are delivered, it's time to kind of rehash that a little bit now that we're approaching the end of this pandemic. So I know we didn't talk about that before, but I'm wondering your view on just sort of maybe a who does what kind of 2.0.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair that we do need to look at that. There's things like court services that the City of Toronto is paying for, childcare. There's a whole bunch of expenses that, are incurred by other municipalities and supported in more amounts by the provincial government. And it, just like you say, we've had uploading and unloading and changing of jurisdictions and responsibilities in the past. Toronto Community Housing is a good example. It used to be called Ontario Housing when we were all growing up. So we do need to look at who is paying for things and how we can make that a little fairer going forward.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned court transfers, and I think that's a really interesting example of kind of this larger conversation, because as the province is moving towards a digital court system, which has been accelerated as a result of the pandemic, prisoner transfers may not be occurring anymore because they're not going to a physical courtroom. And yet the province took on that funding responsibility as a way to say to municipalities, don't worry, we'll help you out a little bit. And now they may not even be incurring a cost, or it might be much lower. So it's just an example to say that the pandemic has really caused us to revisit a lot of the things that we necessarily held to be true, or the traditional roles and responsibilities between the city and the province. So I want to move the conversation a bit more towards the recovery itself. So obviously we can look back and say we should have had some money stowed away, been better prepared, so on and so forth, but that doesn't really help us. Instead, we should be looking forwards towards the recovery. And a lot of Torontonians, a lot of articles you're seeing now are talking about sort of a bold, green, and just recovery plan for the city. Given your background, particularly in environmental science and geoscience, I'm wondering your views specifically on a green recovery and how you think that could be done for the City of Toronto.
Well, it is a very important part of this conversation. Why were we so susceptible to this pandemic? Who was so susceptible? And we need to rebuild better, and we need to be more resilient. And that's resilience for both people and the environment. And last year, the City of Toronto released the resilience strategy that sets the vision, goals, and the actions that will help Toronto survive, adapt, and thrive in the face of any challenge, particularly climate change and population growth. And a pandemic wasn't explicitly pointed out in that document when it was released last year, but I think COVID-19 really does show us that we need to be more resilient to a future pandemic. And there's investments that we can make that help both people in the environment together and make us more resilient to a broad range of perturbations. And those include things like climate change, where we'll have more flooding, heat waves, ice storms. It also includes another pandemic, population growth, which we know is a perturbation that is coming and we need to deal with, and also technological challenges. So things like blackouts or preparing, for example, an EMP. We're not ready for any of these perturbations in the future, as we saw through COVID-19. So really, I see 5 key areas of investment that will protect us. The first is green spaces. And certainly through this pandemic, we saw that we could have used more green space as we had physical crowding and issues getting physical distancing in some of our parks, because they remained the only recreational opportunity that was still available to us. So investing in our green spaces is good for both the environment. It gives us resilience in terms of flood protection, carbon sequestration, and a whole range of good ecological things, but it's also good for people. Transportation, likewise, we need a wider range of transportation options. I think we're all worried following this pandemic that there may be some transit hesitancy, and will people all go back to their single family vehicles? And that's going to be a huge environmental impact. So how do we invest in public transportation, and how do we make more modes of transportation, active transportation in particular, more widely available? The three last areas are buildings, energy, and food security. And if we look at buildings and investing in some of our high-rise towers, for example, that is good both for the environment and people. So if we can invest to, for example, upgrade the heating systems, it's a reduction in energy use. That's good for the environment, but it's also good for public health because they don't have a lot of control on the heat in those apartments. And it's hot in the winter, and it's hot in the summer, and it's hot all year round. Energy systems, likewise, right now we're dependent on this massive grid. And we saw in the, 2002, 2003 blackout, a whole eastern coast of North America went down. So we can, if we're going to be having more storms in the future, having more localized energy sources is good for us both to be resilient to those impacts, but then it's also good for the environment as well. And then lastly, food security. This is another one through the pandemic that we saw that there was the shutdown in some of our large scale, in particular meat production. And it just shows that we could have some more resilience on localized sources, and that would be good in the future in case of a pandemic or any other wide scale perturbation. So I think we need to not just look at it as reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, which is great, but it's also about this broader resilience that we have, and it gives us more elasticity if we have these perturbations to bounce back.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I think that's obviously a well thought through approach to moving forwards. But I'm also curious about it because you mentioned it's not just about greenhouse gas emissions. It's not just about being environmentally friendly or creating a green recovery. But they're also, in that phrase, there's a recovery aspect to it too. And so I'm just wondering about sort of those different policy areas and their ability to sort of stimulate economic activity, get people working again in the city of Toronto, maybe provide ourselves for an economic recovery at the same time that we're looking at green policies as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that as we invest in our buildings, for example, that gets people back to work to upgrade those energy systems, generators in buildings, the boiler systems, that gets people working. Investment in our green space, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. We have the Ravine Trail system. We have an 80-kilometer loop that's proposed to be built in the west end of the city. We have a 16-kilometer trail on the east end of the city. That's the Meadowway. So there's work there to get people out and working in those places as well. Similarly, energy, that's stimulating the green tech sector to see if we can develop some localized solutions to make it a little easier for uptake on the individual basis on homes. So you're absolutely right that it's about protecting the environment. It is about getting people back to work also, which is good.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the interesting sort of themes that I'd pull out of that conversation and out of that list there is almost to say more so of a livable communities within the city. Because I think when most people think about, especially across the province, right, they might think about the city as sort of a monolithic whole. They don't necessarily realize, especially that this pandemic has shown, that if you live in Scarborough or in Etobicoke, you're not necessarily traveling to downtown every day. Maybe you were before, but you're not right now. So having that mix of green space, public transit, properly efficient buildings, food security in localized communities as well, I think is really important rather than just on the city as a whole. So I do want to dive a little bit deeper into one of them that you mentioned, which is public transportation. And so in your community in Scarborough-Rouge Park, there's been a long debated subway extension issue for over a decade. And about a year ago, the Premier unveiled the province's new subway plan for the Greater Toronto area, which included the original 3-stop Scarborough Subway proposal at a price tag of roughly $5.5 billion. I'm curious, as someone who's on the ground talking with constituents on a daily basis, in your view, are you optimistic about that subway plan? Do you think it can get built? And what else do you think needs to be done to improve transit in the Scarborough area more generally?
Well, the residents of Scarborough are undeterred in their want of transit in Scarborough, and we need to move from debates to action. As you said, we have had many, many debates on this issue. I think we have consensus between different levels of government. We have funding in place for the Scarborough Subway, so it's time for us to get the shovels in the ground and get that built. And it's important because the Scarborough Subway will also stimulate our economy, and it will bring much needed jobs and housing to Scarborough. So right now we have many residents that are having to travel long distances to go to work downtown. And wouldn't it be nice to have a livable community and you could go to work in Scarborough? And that's why we need to build the Scarborough Subway, and we need to get going on it as soon as possible. But as you did say, this is a long project, a long-term project. It will take many years to be built. And in the meantime, we really need to improve our local bus service. And buses are really the workhorse of the transit system, and especially in Scarborough. But across the city, they move over 260 million passengers a year. And that's more than any other mode of transit. And during COVID-19, we have problems because we can only put about 30% occupancy onto our buses. So we need to look at how we can ramp that up quickly as we recover. And Councillor Bradford and myself have a motion to the TTC board next week, which is looking at developing by September, advanced priority bus lines on 5 routes. And that's Jane Street, Dufferin Street, Steeles, Finch, and the one that's most important to me in my community, the Eglinton Avenue, Kingston Road, Morningside corridor. So I'm hopeful that we can get these bus lanes up quickly so that we can get people moving to where they need to go as we recover from the COVID-19 pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a a really key point. I know when I was at Queen's Park, both in opposition and in government, to working on policies such as the subway upload at the time, which is ended up in a bit of a, let's call it a partial upload for the expansion projects. But one of the keys there was there was a lot of conversation about, why don't you upload the entire TTC? Why would you only take the subways? And one of the issues is that those bus programs are inherently regional. They are supposed to reflect the demands of individual citizens on the ground, and nobody knows better than the local councillors to which routes are really impacted, in demand, or need to be accelerated. So I think the point you made about additional bus routes is really important. And on that, you mentioned specifically Eglinton. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the University of Toronto Scarborough campus, because I know you've been advocating that campus needs to be connected to rapid transit in a way that it's not currently, and that solution may be looking at an expansion or a portion of the Eglinton Crosstown to make its way out there. So how has that fight gone? What have you been proposing for the University of Toronto Scarborough campus? And how do you think the mayor and other councillors are receiving that conversation?
Well, it remains a priority to me, the Eglinton East LRT extension. That would go from Kennedy Station up to the University of Toronto Scarborough campus, but then north up into Malvern, which I think is a very important area of my community that has not received the investment in transit that it certainly needs. So how do we get there? Through the upload discussion that happened and you were part of at Queen's Park, the funding that the city was going to put into that Scarborough Subway has been released back to the city to be directed into other projects. And so we have been collecting for the Scarborough Subway over the last probably decade or so, $880 million, which is in a dedicated fund. And so I am advocating that money was collected for Scarborough and should be spent in Scarborough. So I would like to see that money released to fund in part the Eglinton East LRT. Now, of course, this will be dependent on our federal partners coming forward. So I've been advocating to all of the MPs of Scarborough because we really need their help with the balance of the funding, since Premier Ford's and his government is funding the Scarborough Subway. We need the federal government to really step up and help us on this project. The mayor has repeatedly said time and time again on camera that he supports the Eglinton East LRT project. And so with his support, I'm going to be working pretty hard with the other councillors in Scarborough so that we can get the 12 councillors we needed on side to get that vote when it comes forward, hopefully sometime maybe this fall.
Oh, that's a good update. I didn't realize it was potentially coming this fall. But in addition to that, I mean, I think this is an interesting opportunity where we're talking about, like we said earlier, green projects coming out of COVID-19, but economic recovery projects. And anything in the transit build space is certainly green and certainly economically going to create some economic activity. So some real potential there to move that forward. So an interesting project, and obviously Scarborough has a lot to say about its transit concerns. So we've heard a lot, and I think continuing to have that conversation is important. But I do want to mention one other topic that's sort of come up in recent weeks. I think when we first had the idea to do this podcast, we knew we'd be talking about COVID-19 and we knew we'd be talking about transit. I don't know if we knew we would be talking about inequality, and it's an important conversation to have. So with the global protests, especially south of the border, and social media campaigns calling for anti-racism justice, they brought to light a movement that really needs to be discussed. In Canada, we've witnessed some large protests in our major cities, including right here in Toronto, and 2 councillors in Toronto have tabled and supported a motion to reduce the Toronto Police Service budget by 10% in 2021 and reallocate those funds to some community-led alternatives to policing and at-risk youth programming. As an elected official in a ward where the majority of your constituents are visible minorities, including the Black community, I can imagine you've got a really unique perspective on this situation and this conversation. So what are your views about this proposal more specifically, and about the movement more generally, and how it's impacting the residents of Ward 25?
Well, you're right. I live in a wonderfully diverse ward, and I am so privileged to represent this community. And it's important that we say out loud in these times that systemic racism is real and presents additional barriers for Black Canadians. And the tragic death of Regis Korchinski-Packett here in Toronto is a harsh reminder that we need to do more faster. And we've had roundtables, we've had commissions, we've had discussions, and it's time for us to implement actions. And those are actions that will improve police accountability specifically. So this includes things like body cameras on police, improving the independence and the transparency of the Special Investigations Unit, improving responses that involve mental health crises, and continuing to increase the diversity of the police force itself. And defunding the police by 10% sounds like a great talking point, but I'm not sure it fully addresses the issue and will result in the outcomes that we want to have. Our complement of police officers has stayed around 5,500 for the last decade or so, but yet our population has increased by 2.3 million to 3 million. So we need to look at funding priorities, but I don't know that we necessarily have to get that funding from the Toronto Police. And instead, we need to ensure that we have a robust system of social supports and services that can break down barriers of systemic racism. And no budget demand, and that includes the Toronto Toronto Police Service or any other service, should stand in the way of that. And so one program that we brought forward this year through the budget process is the new Youth Violence Grant, which was created this spring, and it will allocate $6 million in funding to our communities. And what I like about this program is that it is funding proposals that come from the community for the community. And the concept was in part due to advocacy of myself on the budget committee because of what I was hearing from the Danzig community. And the Danzig community in my ward is one that had a very tragic death last year of a young man. And the community wants to turn their Toronto Community Housing End Unit into a community hub. And this is great because through this program, they're applying, and I'm so hopeful that they'll be successful. They're applying for programs that will fund breakfast programs, they'll fund after school programs, they'll fund a safe place for the youth to hang out with their friends. And it's great because it's entirely community led and programmed. And so this is one example of a program that we developed, and we developed it without cutting other budgets. So we do need to find ways to increase these programs, and we need broad changes across the entire city, not just in the police. So on Monday, the Board of Health recognized that anti-Black racism is a public health crisis. And I think that was fantastic. I was happy to vote for it. It was unanimously adopted. And one of the recommendations includes that the board attends anti-Black racism training led by Taibu, which is a great service agency in my community. And we also requested that the Civic Appointments Committee looks at how they can increase the representation of the Black community on the Board of Health as well as other committees. And I think in general, we could do a lot to improve representation with just simply giving a seat at the table to our prominent members of the Black community that are doing so much to advocate and so much to support and help each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it's a really well thought out answer and set of potential actions that the municipal level can take, because I think this is where it's important. Obviously, the provincial and federal government have roles to play, specifically funding roles and a lot of sort of addressing some systemic problems with institutions, but there's no better chance to get local and to get the feelings and the thoughts of community members than through their city councillor in this situation. So I think it really is important, the work that you're doing, and the work that the whole city council is taking on now to have this conversation openly and publicly. And so, as we approach the end of the podcast here and the end of the conversation, I do want to just ask one general one, which is, it's your first term as a city councillor, and we're not quite there yet, but we're approaching the halfway mark in that mandate. Any reflections on the first sort of year and 3/4 or year and a half? I mean, obviously, I don't think you knew that you were signing up to be a city councillor during a pandemic or all the other things that have happened, but reflections on the role and what it's like to be a city councillor in Scarborough.
Well, the word that always comes to mind when people ask me about my job is gratitude. I'm just so very grateful for this wonderful opportunity. I enjoy every single day, and it is a responsibility that I take seriously because I know I'm very lucky to have it. And while I certainly didn't expect to be a councillor during a pandemic, I really have I've just been so warmed by what I see in the community. And whether it's car parades that drive by children's houses on their birthdays to cheer for them, or the community coming together to raise funds for our long-term care centers, which have been really struggling, or a car parade we organized to donate food, where we were able to collect over 3,800 pounds of food in just half an hour from the community in this drive-through. I have just been overwhelmed by what I see, and just such gratitude that I represent such a wonderful community, and so proud of the residents of Toronto during this time.
I think that's a very nice note to end on. It's certainly been a remarkable time, and hopefully we can get back to a bit more of a sense of normal, but that type of community building approach can still stay when we get back to that normal. So just wanted to say thank you very much for coming on the podcast and taking time out of a busy schedule. I think we packed a lot into the conversation, and listeners are going to have a much better understanding of your role and the interests of the community of Scarborough and of the city more generally. So thanks for coming on the program, Councillor.
Thanks for having me on my first podcast.
Really appreciate it. And now you're an expert, so you can go and do a whole bunch more, and hopefully that includes coming back on our show in the near future.
Well, I just learned from the best, so thank you.
Much appreciated. We'll talk soon. Thank you for listening to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corps Institute of Public Policy and Economy, produced by Sarah Bordeaux and myself. The views expressed during this podcast are not necessarily the views of Strategy Corp. All rights to this episode are reserved, and guests on the podcast may be current or past clients of Strategy Corp. To find out more about the Institute and to subscribe to our written material, or to find past episodes of the podcast, please visit our website at www.strategycorp.com/institute. Until next time, I'm Mitch Davidson.